welcome to our blog. And today we're with Alex Prähauser, who is probably the sole membership of my Austrian fan base.
Yay!
Before we get into anything, I've been to Austria when I lived in München during a year of my undergrad education. This is before the euro was even a thing yet, so that's going to date. It's exactly the year before the euro currency came out. It dates me.
I vaguely remember that, very vaguely. My mom is still calculating in shilling.
Yeah. I do remember having to figure out shillings versus Deutschmarks versus. We also spent time in Greece versus like drachmas, and all I really remember, things were a lot cheaper for an American then than they were just a year later. However, I became aware of you because you wrote an article really parsing out some of the ideas that came up in discussion between me and Kuba Wisnowski, I think. You'd think I'd learn how to pronounce Polish names by now. And Kuba and I were talking about the situation in Europe, and that's not what we're going to talk about today. But we began discussing. Actually, you started sending me articles.
I started spamming you.
Yeah, which I did kind of cursory go through on category theory and Marxist use of math and dealing with Hegel and mathematical categories and weird math mysticism, and my sort of skepticism about the modern state of math theory, but also realizing that in so much that Marxists were playing with math, they were generally playing with it from either the 19th century or through French weird misappropriations of set theory that were also already out of date.
Yeah. So a problem with math in general, and with the intersection of math and other sciences, particularly social sciences and stuff, is that math has just grown exponentially over the last century. I think it was maybe the fastest growing science of all. I don't know what would rival it. So mathematics of today, like current research level mathematics, only has like a superficial similarity. Or maybe it would be more fair to say it is very, very different on the surface, but some of the essential ideas have carried over, but it has expanded in a way that makes it impossible. Like, it's often said that David Hilbert, I'm automatically saying the names in English, if they're German, he was the last person in mathematics who had a general overview of all of the areas of mathematics, and that was in the 1930s. And since then, so much has happened that no person could ever keep track of it. Even some of the greatest minds of mathematics of all time have been born after that. But they were all already kind of specialists, at least in some way. Of course, this is a real problem if you're trying to get into math from another science. And it's even a problem if you're trying to get into another area of mathematics from one where you're already proficient in. But I think we really have to try to further this to further the connections between mathematics and in particular economics as Marxists, in order to just get a better understanding of what is happening in economics. Because each time I'm starting to look at an economical system or something, and I'm just starting to seriously think about it, my first reaction is always like, how can you say anything about it? It's way too complicated. It's way too complex. It's like several orders of complexity beyond something that has been attempted by theoretical mathematicians and still a few orders that beyond that which is normal in applied mathematics. But I really think that if you're trying to like build up a socialist system or something, we really need to have a good understanding of economics, and for that we will need mathematics. And in particular, because you said in another podcast of yours that you kind of want to do theory again, paraphrasing you, but with like cybernetics and probability theory, which is of course a good start. But as I was telling you, you really need category theory. And at that point in time, I was not particularly clear about what you need category theory for, but it has been a common theme in pure mathematics and more recently in applied mathematics that category theory starts appearing pretty much everywhere. And at this point in time, I have a much better idea for some of the potential applications of category theory in economics. But yeah, we need to build on that, you know.
Yeah. So one of the things that you and I have talked about, we were talking about it even before we started recording today, was that in so much that socialists, Marxists, thinkers in general, we have a weird penchant for hanging on to the early 20th century. Like when we talk about psychology, we're still talking about Freud and maybe Lacan and maybe, frankly, literary and philosophical uses of Freud and Lacan, but not actually more recent psychiatric research. All of which, with the caveat, like I know that there's a crisis of replication. I know that there's a lot of bad math in psychological research right now, and but that started getting me thinking, well, if we don't understand that, then we obviously probably haven't touched math in a while. I mean, when you ask someone to deal with the problems of Marx and Engels' attempts at science and math, the issues with the dialectics of nature from Engels' side, or are Marx's mathematical notebooks, usually people don't even have a basic understanding of math enough to see why they're wrong. They, or what the problem with them are. It will be just written off as, well, that's something Marx did. They don't really work. I don't really know why it doesn't work. And somebody who knew something better once told me that maybe he was trying to invent calculus, which is interesting because and we will come back to category theory, but I think this is related. Marx was trying to work on something cutting edge in math because of a lack of understanding at the time.
Well,
Go ahead.
if I can, okay. He also didn't know like the cutting edge of mathematical research of the day, and so he was trying to kind of reinvent something that other people were also working on. And I think if he had known about the other attempts, he might have done it a little bit differently. But what he did was actually interesting and has been furnished into something useful by Lavere. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But yeah, he was trying to reinvent calculus, which is an old problem that mathematics or mathematicians have always kind of felt uncomfortable with, because the early inventors of calculus, they all used infinitesimals, and the exact nature of infinitesimals was never really very clear. And the stuff Hegel talked about in Science of Logic has been made by Lavere into a kind of into something that can handle infinitesimals. But at that point in time, when Marx was writing his mathematical thesis, infinitesimals were very much looked at with suspicion, and people were trying to replace them. And Marx was among those people. He also threw out infinitesimals, unrightfully so, in my opinion. But yeah, again, what he was trying to do was kind of not completely correct from a mathematical perspective, but it was also a failure from an interesting perspective. And kind of the tools to make the thing precise that he was trying to do were just not available at the time. That's 100 years later, before you can do something like that.
So, but before we get into category theory, I mean, I think, for example, my audience probably doesn't understand what infinitesimals are, and why there's been such a controversy around them for the last 150 question mark years. It's been a long time.
Way more. It goes back to the Greeks, really. They were kind of uncomfortable with infinitesimals. Others actually really liked them. So it's been a long, long controversy. I've actually been reading through that over the last few days. And yeah, infinitesimals should be numbers that are smaller than any, not just any natural number, but any real number under what we understand as real numbers. And the exact problem with that is, well, people have always looked at new mathematical constructions with suspicion. They didn't like negative numbers when they were introduced. They didn't like the complex numbers when they were introduced. Thus, we have the term imaginary number, which kind of denotes something that apparently isn't as real numbers. But really, the battle is already lost with real numbers. They are already pretty weird. And so, of course, with infinitesimals, it was the same thing. People were kind of suspicious about them. They were suspicious of their ontological status because they were kind of weirder than normal natural numbers. And there's a kind of sentiment that has been best formulated by Leonhard Kronecker, the mathematician, who said that God created the natural numbers. Everything else is the work of man. And well, it has a kind of logic to it.
Yeah, to pick up on that for a second, when we talk about like the natural or real existence of mathematics as a that's one of the things I point out too, because I'm like, yeah, in the world you can see things that are corollary directly to real numbers, but when we start getting into concepts like negative numbers or complex and imaginary numbers are infinitesimals or multiple infinities, you don't see that, and there's no natural correlate to it.
Well, it's complicated because if you really want to look at our natural world, like you
response. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can say that everything we see around us is in terms of magnitudes of the Planck length. So really, reality looks very continuous, but it's actually, if you look at it very closely, then it's actually discrete. So you could you can definitely throw out real numbers. Like there is no real quantity that corresponds to like pi or something, like some irrational number that isn't an amount you see in the natural world. But you could also throw out really I guess you can't do without the rationals, but you can definitely throw out real numbers. But on the other hand, real numbers appear in natural laws as sometimes conversion rates between like particles or something. So a particle might change with the probability of a real number that is not a rational number and not even a computable number, which is very interesting from a computability perspective. And like engineers need to use complex numbers. So it's kind of like, well, you can break down everything to natural numbers or at least rationals. But at the same time, if you do that, then all of the elegant descriptions that we have of nature and even of like engineering and stuff, you're throwing all of that out of the window.
So yeah, so that's important. So now to build towards why we need to talk about category theory, because you were talking about, I've been pushing for more discussions of cybernetics, of complexity theory, and there have been debates. For example, one of the most hotly contested debates in my Patreon group was my assertion that complex social systems actually use real energy, and thus you can calculate them. you can do energy calculuses with them, and I got a lot of pushback from physicists who were like, well, that's analogous, you can't do that. And then I was like, well, but social systems are made up of discrete real actors, blah 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 blah. And I realized, and this doesn't seem related, but I realized like we don't have a mathematical theory that can actually parse when we're being real and when we're being analogous. And
Category theory can kind of do that.
Right. And this gets me to the like, oh, this is why category theory is necessary, because otherwise we're going to go around and around and around on whether or not something is an analogy to something else, or if something is real, or if we just become nominalist about everything, including physics. So what's at stake in category theory, and how did it develop?
So, yeah, I thought exactly that I would give kind of a historical introduction. And category theory was developed by Saunders Mac-Lane and Daniel Eilenberg. And Saunders Mac-Lane was, for those who know who that is, he was one of the last people from Hilbert's school. So that's kind of mathematical formalism. And it's a very modernist understanding of mathematics, and category theory really pushes this forward. And the problem that those two were faced with is they had what's called a topological space. Many people will not know what it is, but you can kind of just think of that as space. They had kind of spaces that they wanted to understand further. And they were starting to associate with those spaces invariants, which were not just numerical invariants. For instance, you could try to understand the space by looking at the diameter of the space to see how big it is or something. But those invariants were of a more sophisticated nature. So they were kind of algebraic invariants. So you would associate to every space a kind of algebraic structure that would tell you something about the internal structure of that space. And there were several different ways to associate to a space such algebraic structures, which are called groups. But what they noticed was that there was a natural connection between those associations of invariants to spaces. And this term natural, which has grown very important in category theory, was first handled purely informally. They were saying that this is a natural transformation between two such mappings. And what category theory really came out of was an attempt to explain what natural transformation really meant. And the way they started to understand this is they were looking at those spaces and they were saying like, well, we have those spaces and we have kind of mappings between them. That, for instance, we can say that a space is a subspace of another space. So that is a kind of embedding of a space into another space. And we can look at these spaces from an external perspective. So these spaces would just be kind of points. And between those spaces would go mappings between the spaces that would map one space into another space. And these mappings we would call morphisms. So we have objects and we have morphisms. And the characteristic property that a category has is that you can compose these morphisms. So if we think, well, we can embed a space into another space and that second space into a third space, well, we can embed the first space into the third space. And this is just an abstraction of this property. And so this was the concept of a category. And then they said, all right, we are looking at assigning each topological space an invariant. And those should interact well with the mappings between spaces. And those should be functors. So they call this a functor, and it should map topological spaces to groups. And it should map mappings between topological spaces to mappings between groups. That's a functor. And then a natural transformation should kind of intermediate between functors and should kind of should be a kind of connection between one functor and another functor that is kind of made out of the mappings between groups. So the important part that I want to instill here is that what was the focus from the very beginning of category theory? It was the most abstract or most high in a precise mathematical, but also in a kind of heuristic sense. The most high and sophisticated concept of natural transformation, and they needed the other two to say exactly what a natural transformation is. And so they developed the other two, but just the other two you can kind of handle heuristically. You don't really need category theory for it. It is really the exact description of the third thing that was essential. And well, a kind of higher structure emerges when you go from categories to an external perspective on categories. So you have in a category you have objects with maps between them, and between categories you have functors, which are again like maps in some way, but then you have maps between maps. So this kind of third structure was an emergent structure, which the emergence of this structure is kind of magical if you look at it from a mathematical perspective, and it gives rise to a very rich theory. And so this was how this was the problem that category theory was designed for, was assigning invariants to spaces. And at first it was treated like a very convenient language, but it wasn't given much of a focus on its own. It was actually thought by MacLean and Eilenberg that the original paper they wrote on category theory would be the only paper on category theory that would ever be written, because they thought that is pretty much the end of the theory. Now, all of this changed when Alexander Grothendieck entered the scene, who was, he really was a textbook genius. I'm not using this word in this context lightly. He was not just very intelligent, he thought very different to other people. And he was the first to recognize the true potential of category theory. And he started to develop what is called the relative perspective on mathematics, where before you would talk, for instance, about the properties of a space. You would say that the space is smooth in the sense that that it doesn't break up at a certain point or something. It doesn't have any corners or something. You would say that about a whole space. But he said he noticed that with category theory, you can develop all of this relatively. So you can say a map between spaces is smooth. So a space is smooth relative to another space. And this was a major breakthrough. And he developed lots and lots of theories that I cannot explain in any reasonable time frame.
Understood.
Yes, but I thought I could maybe take a very small piece of his achievements, by no means even among the great ones, which is kind of a puzzle, because you might have heard about the notion of isomorphism, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe explain what it is?
Isomorphism. Let me think. So it's a concept that derives from like the idea of equal forms or equal shapes, and this that you can use these shapes to kind of map out the relationships between sets or other kind of like formal constructs, which was kind of important in like Anglo set theory, but I don't really know its context here.
All right. So in mathematics, isomorphisms are very important. They are special morphisms. And from an internal perspective, you can describe an isomorphism as a kind of mapping that keeps all of the structure of whatever you're looking at unchanged, but it exchanges the names of all of the elements of the thing you're looking at. So you might have the real numbers, and yet then you might exchange the real numbers for some other kind of structure where every real number is just called something differently, but they work in exactly the same way. And then you can say, well, I have an isomorphic mapping between those that associates every number in the one system with a number in the other system. So these two systems are isomorphic. And this is an important notion of equivalence between mathematical structures. And in general, it is assumed that every mathematical property that is well defined should be invariant under isomorphism, so that it does not matter what you call your elements. It only matters how the structure you're looking at is operating. So that's the internal perspective of an isomorphism. The external perspective of an isomorphism is even simpler, because you can say an isomorphism is just a morphism in a category between two objects. So you have one object, you have another object, and between those you have a morphism. And this morphism has an inverse that goes in the other direction. And if you go along one and then you go along the other, then it's the same as if you have done nothing, and in the other direction too. So that is the category theoretic treatment of isomorphisms, which is you see the rich interaction between internal and external notions here, but also so the right notion of equivalence within a category is isomorphism. I'm just going to postulate that as an axiom. Mm-hmm. Now the question is, what is the right notion of equivalence between categories? Because in each category you have objects and you have isomorphisms between them.
Okay.
You want to try?
No, I'm lost.
So. All right. So I'll just say that the right notion of equivalence is then isomorphism up to isomorphism. So
okay, yeah, okay. I'm following you now.
Makes sense, right?
Right.
And Grothendieck was the first to notice this, and this actually vastly increased the explanatory power of category theory. Many other things happened at the same time, but that's one of those things. And so, from that point in time, category theory was started to be taken seriously and was starting to be come into its own as an independent area of mathematical research. And then Lavere entered the scene, and Lavere is in particular interesting for us because he kind of codified Hegelian dialectics in category theory. Where I should, of course, give some caveats to say that I by no means mean, or Lavere also not, by no means means to imply that all of Hegelian dialectics is just category theory. What he's saying is there's a very useful kind of calculus that is very akin to just the first order logical calculus of predicate logic. That can be formulated using category theory, and that very nicely aligns with, or is directly inspired by what Hegel wrote about his dialectics. And okay, so I should also just mention that Lavere was an active Marxist-Leninist, is a Marxist-Leninist, is not active anymore. And I think that also played into his desire to kind of codify this, and also his later treatment of Marx.
Well, it's interesting because Lavere immediately it's like, oh, a name I know. I know this because I started looking into the attempts starting in the 1960s, largely with people like Lakatos to deal with math and in Hegelian categories. And Lavere seems to be, I mean, Lakatos is fine, but Lavere seemed to be more respected in mathematical circles, not just philosophy of mathematics. So,
to be honest with you, I've never heard the name Lakatos.
Okay. So Lakatos is just a student of Lukács who worked with the analytic philosophers in America when he was in exile. And he's important not because he was not a mathematician. He was trying to do philosophy of math, so trying to figure out how you could ground math and justify it as a science, but also he was trying to figure out how you define science, because he was unsatisfied with the positivism, of course, then logical positivism, and then its own collapse of verifiability, and then he had problems with Popper's falsification thesis because probability also messes with that. And he's not known in mathematical circles that much. He's more known in philosophy of science circles. But if you look up dialectics and math, you're going to get him in English. And he most of his late work is in English, and not Hungarian or German. And then you're going to get Levert. And so I did this, obviously. And so this was my only foray into this, but I knew nothing about category theory. My initial response, and we'll get to this later, was that, okay, so category theory is what replaced set theory. I obviously was not educated in this in my basic ass math classes in uni. I'm going to just accept this as truth because it's beyond my pay grade. And that was my initial response to it. So how does Levert's work reconcile, Hegelian dialectics with category theory? What is it exactly doing?
Well, it's very interesting, and I should say I actually came upon Levert way before I was looking into Hegelian philosophy, or before I was.
Yeah, you came upon it the proper way. It's supposed to be
Well,
like, find mathematicians who are Marxists.
So what Levert is doing exactly is the central notion that he's using is that of a unity of opposites. So the idea is that you have one structure, which you can think of them as categories in both cases. You have one structure and you have another structure. And this structure is embedded into the other structure at two kind of opposite extremes. So in many contexts, you can kind of think of a category as an order. It is not exactly an order, but it is very similar to it. And in particular, you can, a lot of categories have like a beginning and an end. And usually the one structure is embedded in the other structure at the beginning and at the end in some mathematical sense. And between them is spanned the whole other category. And this is kind of his formalization of a unity of opposites, because the object that is embedded is embedded two times, but in exactly opposite contexts. So in the abstract, those two embedding, or those two kind of substructures are the same, but in the concrete, they are exactly opposite, and in fact, they have to be abstractly the same to be concretely opposite. So the simplest example is the beginning and the end of a line. The beginning of the line is a point, the end of the line is a point, and between them is the whole line, and they are exactly opposites because they are the same, because they are both points.
They're both points, but they exist at opposite ends of a line and thus do opposite things. Therefore, they are both the same and opposite definitionally at the same time. Yeah. Got it. All right.
Yes. And the next thing on his list was Aufhebung. And this is where it gets a little more complicated. But roughly speaking, you can kind of unify these two sub-objects as let's stick with the example of a line. You can say, well, both of these objects are, of course, related in that they are the opposite ends of the same line. So now you might look at a square, and you can say the one line of the square is, again, the opposite of the other line of the square. And that is kind of his idea of Aufhebung, that you have a higher unity of opposites that encompasses the previous unity of opposites at one of its moments.
Okay.
And in this sense, it's really beautiful because it really captures all the three ideas of all the three meanings of Aufhebung, which is to preserve. The original opposition is preserved in the higher opposition. It is also negated because now you have an opposing moment. And it is also sublated because, now you have this higher opposition of unities that, it's literally a higher extension of the previous opposition of unities.
Okay.
And so,
okay. Yes. Okay. It is. I think it's making sense to me as we talk about it. And I can see how that would mean that, I mean, this would vindicate certain elements of Hegel's longer logic that seem to have been generally written off as purely mystical
yes.
priorly.
And I myself, if I had read Hegel before I've known about this, I would have said this is just mystical mumbo jumbo. I mean, I'm interested in mystical stuff, mostly because of kind of my family background. But
I'm also interested in mystical mumbo jumbo, but I will call it what it is. So.
Yeah. But Labert made it into an exact mathematical structure, and then he applied it to kind of categorical set theory. So it's not just that set category theory replaced set theory, but those two are kind of they also fuck the English word. They ergänzen.
Overlap.
Complement each other.
Complement. Yeah.
Yeah, they complement each other.
I was going to ask you more about set theory and category theory, because I know that they relate and they're not the same, but they're also not opposed. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, maybe we can just give a very brief interlude so that we understand category theory a little bit better and how it understands structures. Because the thing is that in category theory, you can derive every internal kind of notion about an object from its position in the network of objects of the same kind. So you might have a real number, and you can understand this as the embedding of a point into the real number line. And there is a very fundamental lemma of category theory, the so-called Yoneda lemma, which basically tells you that, in fact, the internal structure of an object in a category is completely detected by the morphisms that go into this object in the category. So in category theory, there is a very rich interplay between the internal and the external. And fundamentally, category theory is about the external perspective, but you can derive the internal perspective on any particular object from its place within the larger nexus. And of course, and I know you see this immediately, that this is very connected to structuralism and to process philosophy and all of these things. That's also why category theory is often identified with structuralism in mathematics. And on the other hand, every category itself is an object in a larger nexus. So you never really completely get out of the internal perspective either. And so set theory can be reformulated within category theory, kind of on purely external grounds. So you give some axioms for a category that this category should fulfill, and then you can derive the usual statements that you have in set theory from these. So you have then not a set that consists of objects, but rather you have one object in a category. You don't have a set that consists of elements, but rather you have an object within a category. And this object has certain generalized elements that are given by the embeddings of other objects into this object, and in particular from the point of this category, so the kind of one element set of this category into this object. So in other words, an object with or an element of a set is the same thing as an embedding of the one element set into this object.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that clarifies it to some degree. Um, so would it be fair to say that one of the things, I mean, set theory seems abstract, but but in some ways the morphisms and stuff in category theory are even more abstract than the elements in set theory. And by
Well,
abstract I mean just formal.
um,
No, yes.
yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are different kinds of abstraction within mathematics, and traditional set theory very much goes into the kind of logical model theoretic treatment of objects, where you kind of think about them in terms of symbols and strings of letters and stuff like that. Whereas category theory goes in a very different direction, where you think of everything in terms of morphisms and well, morphisms mainly, and higher morphisms sometimes. And I think one of the things that I want to qualify in this context is that I at least find the abstraction of category theory a lot easier to handle than the abstraction of set theory. So I've learned set theory. I kind of hate the traditional treatments of set theory because I've studied actually one where they wrote all the time about set of C, the kind of mainstream set theory, and they said something really difficult. And then at the end of the proof, they mentioned, well, we could also use this thing that is equivalent to set of C, and the whole proof goes over way easier. But we're still going to use set of C, and I hate this kind of stuff. Category theory is nothing like that. In category theory, the easiest solution is the one that is taken. So category theory is in particular distinguished from other mathematical disciplines by its complete conceptual clarity. Not every category theoretical construction is completely conceptually clear, but the aim is to have as clear of mathematics as you can possibly have. And this is also why it is largely identified with conceptual mathematics, and why it is, I think, way easier to handle than more traditional systems like set theory.
Okay. I like. I don't like elegance as a criterion for truth, but I do like elegance as a criterion for discussing things or operating, because I've never loved when like you said in set theory, like we're going to choose to do something the hard way so that it's more consistent with this theory, even though we realize that there are easier ways to do this. Have a nice day.
Yeah.
That's
the clearer
maddening.
the water, the further you can see is always the analogy I'm using.
Yeah, and category theory does seem to be helpful, and now we can turn a little bit to what we know its practicality to be, because people are probably like, okay, well, why does all this abstract shit matter? And the first thing I will say is modern computing theory is largely based on category theory. So can you go into that a little bit?
Oh yeah, I mean, it is largely based on type theory, but those two things are pretty much the same. Like, type theory is an internal perspective on category theory to a large extent. And well, type theory is about like what sorts do, like, you might have, for instance, programmers have often seen this, that you have an object of a particular sort. So you might have an object of the integers, and then you can't divide it by certain numbers because it is not of the sort of a rational number or something. And type theory is the underlying structure that structures how sorts are interrelated. So I'm using sorts here as synonymous with types. And yeah, type theory kind of tells you how these different types are related. And category theory does the same thing, but it does it from an external perspective. And there is kind of a very, very deep theorem that tells you that traditional logic and type theory and category theory are to a large extent the same. So you can identify a morphism in a category with a proof in logic and with a program in type theory. Those three things are identifiable, and category theory can tell you the exact sense in which they are identifiable.
And that's important, because otherwise you're I mean, prior to talk about like the classical case, of aligning predicate logic with math theory is geometry, for example, like in the ancient world. And if you literalize that, like say Plato does, stuff gets weird. So having an ability to having a base theory that can tie type theory or programming or language to formal logic formalization to something deeper is actually a big fucking deal. Um, and this is why it's important to that thing we were talking about way back when you're trying to figure out what is an analogy and what is, quote, real or natural, and for naturalness to have any kind of useful meaning in the formal sense, because it's so the question of natural and like in like linguistic philosophy is one of those things where I go off Wittgensteinian, because I'm like, well, the concepts start getting weird, but if you're defining it mathematically, you have something to work off of. You can start dealing with these things in a way where you can actually say something about structures and the way they might work from one level of discussion to another, instead of just being like, well, this level of science, we can't talk about it at this other level of science because there's an implaceable language gap or concept gap that makes moving from one to the other impossible. And that's helpful. It's also one of these things where I used to think, for example, that like statistics and these other maths are the only maths that you use in a practical day-to-day language, but actually no, number theory, category theory are something that we actually kind of are conceptually like using without realizing it kind of all the time.
Yes, and one of the most important functions of category theory, as they say within category theory, is that it makes the trivial seem trivially trivial. So, clarification is actually one of the main benefits of category theory. There are lots of others, but it is definitely up there, and it gives you a kind of mental framework that makes it very easy to distinguish, for instance, a theory and a model, or I don't know, a particular kind of logic and the structures within that kind of logic and stuff like that.
Yeah. As a side note, this is someone who comes out of linguistic philosophy. The theory versus model versus reality debate is a maddening debate that people often don't realize, that they don't that how without mathematics it's an almost impossible thing to deal with. But yeah, so this brings me to a question though. This all seems I think to the average political thinker, this is all going to seem extremely abstract or abstruse. But one thing you and I both agree with is we're very frustrated with political radicals who often come up with other kinds of very abstract and abstruse philosophies, not using modern math theory, modern physics, or and using them responsibly, not just as like math themes or something.
Yeah, like Lacan with
Yeah.
misusing elementary mathematical concepts. I hate that stuff, and I also hate when I have heard this from Marxists from time to time, that they're like, well, all of this mathematics is basically bad because it's not dialectical enough, and we can't really have real mathematics within capitalism because, like The means of our mode of production influences our thoughts and so on and so forth. And I'm like, well, all right, but we do need something, because we do need like socialism, and we need to have an idea of how an economy works to change it into something else. And like, if you don't like it, then make it better. Like, you're invited.
Well, yeah, this is an important point, because I used to be one of these people who took the mode of production / knowledge production seriously, on an almost Foucauldian sense, even, whereas like you're talking about one episteme, you can't speak to another episteme. We don't really understand what it means to think like a Platonist, because we live in a capitalist society and have and to some degree I still hold on to a loose sense of that. Like, no, the average modern Platonist doesn't actually think like an ancient Platonist.
Sure, but the same is true about Neoplatonists, for example.
Right. But that's a superficial problem, and it is an obscurantist argument to say that we can't deal with math because we can't get the true math until we have socialism, or we can't deal with analytic philosophy because it's not properly dialectical. But then read what people are citing as their reasons for this. I mean, my favorite one and the most obvious one is all these people who bring up 19th century arguments against the Big Bang as propagated by Lenin and Trotsky, based off of misconceptions of what both dialectics and energy flows actually are, and that's predicated on just not keeping up with modern math and science. And yes, if modern math and science is corrupted by capitalism, and to some degree I would say duh, but that doesn't mean that, like, that would also be the analogous argument is we can't use English because it was developed by capitalist Brits, and we should only be speaking in some true socialist language which doesn't exist yet. Therefore, we should not deal with linguistics. Well, like, that's a ridiculous argument as soon as you phrase it that way.
Yeah. Well, two things. First off, of course, we have to build socialism out of capitalism, and we have to use the tools that are available to us. This is elementary Marxism, I think. Second, there is a sleight of hand that really annoys me, and that I have seen Marxists do quite a few times, which is that first they say something like, it's one of the most natural things to consider that our mode of societal reproduction influences all areas of society, and in particular also our thinking. All right. And then they go to, therefore we might not be able to think certain things, or, like, as they wrote in the Communist Manifesto, don't come to us with, like, I'm of course paraphrasing, with your notions of freedom and equality and justice and so on and so forth. These are all created by the mode of production and will vanish as soon as this changes. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Is our thinking influenced by our mode of production, or is it determined by our mode of production? Because in the natural sciences, those two are very different. Because if our thinking is influenced by our mode of production, then we might think that certain things are implausible, and that certain things are more plausible than we might actually than they might actually be. And so, if we have, for instance, a physical theory, we might try the things that we think are most plausible first. And if they don't work, then we can always go to the implausible ones. So in this case, the scientific process still works even within capitalism. It just might be very much slower because our weightings of what is probable and what is not probable might be wrong. But if our thinking is determined by our mode of production, then there might be thoughts that we just cannot think, not because our thinking is inherently not capable of doing this, but because our economic system does not allow for us to think this. So then it might be that, for instance, the true nature of the universe just cannot be thought by us within our economy as we have it. Those two are very different things, and I'm not saying that the second one is wrong or something. I'm just saying, don't do this sleight of hand because it's bad thinking.
So this is something that has this exact problem bugs me, because I tend to think that the first assertion is obvious, and the second assertion, I don't even know how you'd prove it. Like, I don't know how you'd prove that we can't think certain thoughts because of our mode of production. Although I can clearly think of ways that you can at least complicate that assertion. It's like, well, clearly, if we go back to prior modes of production or semi-modes of production or whatever, you start seeing people thinking capitalist-like thoughts way before the system of its instantiation existed. Like, you can go back to the late antique Rome and start seeing people messing with ideas that are concurrent with liberalism, but they can't pull them off yet for whatever reason. And this leads to weird errors in Marxism, and not so much a mathematical thing, where you have to continuously redefine what a mode of production is and broaden it to where you get like certain, like Jairus Banerjee, who thinks that we can now talk about commercial capitalism going all the way back into like the 2nd century of the Roman Empire, if not before. Or you get into where we have to jettison modes of production altogether, because clearly, if it's a concrete, discrete unit, we can find elements of other things. So this category is useless.
Well, but you can also, I think, have like a third option, which would be, well, people can have these thoughts, but the societal preconditions are just not given for these thoughts
Bingo.
to catch on. Yeah,
exactly. That's my answer to the question, is like the material and social conditions for thoughts to be broadly adopted don't exist, but an individual can clearly think them, right? Like, to me, that's the natural conclusion that we can draw, which means then we should use everything that currently exists at our thing, knowing that we're probably just going to be slower in actually using it. Like, we're not going to be like, or it's going to be used in a strange way, or said the teleos of a technology rebuild is going to be geared towards something that we're going to have to change, but the actual like engineering is probably useful. And if you don't go this way, I know this has fallen out of favor in the last 10 years, but I saw this a lot in the 90s and the aughts. You end up thinking yourself, well, we have to like completely destroy all bourgeois and all technological society and embrace, like, I don't know, primitive communism or rewilding or something, because everything is corrupted by the mode of production and there's nothing in which we can salvage.
yeah,
I don't find that useful
problem
at all. I think first of all, I think that deduction is based on like a logical error, but two, I think it's kind of insane. Like, it's it's just like, okay, so we have to reject everything. And if you take this to its logical conclusion, like someone like John Searson actually tried to do in the United States, you start like talking about how we need to lobotomize the human being so that they can't develop abstract stock, so they can't have reification, so that they can't redevelop civilization and thus redevelop the modes of production. And it's just like, what? like and even Saracen doesn't continue with this, but he has an essay where he goes there, and I'm just like, yeah, this is why this way of thinking doesn't get you what you want it to, I think.
Yeah. But I mean, it's at least valuable as a kind of counterexample of an example of what not to do.
Yeah, it is. It there's a lot of good things to be learned negatively, like, but I think the Frankfurt School also is as much as I like the Frankfurt School, is also sometimes a good example of what not to do, because their arguments against positivism become an argument against like pretty much all of science and or technological development, even though they don't actually hold primitivist readings of society, that their attacks on positivism actually are part of the logic of the people who do. So
You
It's
can easily
interesting.
abuse that. I mean, you can say that this is already kind of an abuse, but because Marxism is such a totalizing critique of society, it lends itself to these kind of thought extremes. And at the same time, we can't just go the postmodern route and just say, well, there are no meta narratives. There is only like local narratives, and we can't do that either. So I think what we have to do is we have to like go the path of Marxism, at least in so much as it is politically relevant. But at the same time, we have to be really careful about our thinking so that we don't do any leaps that might get us into like these weirder territories.
So to bring this back to math, we're talking about how category theory, and I think our example of it is how, okay, now we have a way to formally say Hegelian dialectical logic, as stated in the science, it does not have to be pseudoscientific mysticism, or just, or a scientific, mysticism. Not all mysticism is pseudoscientific, but that it is actually, we can formalize it in a way that is productively useful for doing for doing practical math, and also coming up with a theory which makes that practical math possible, and jumping between category. Well, I hate English right now because categories here has two meanings, but jumping between levels of description, like we were talking about with say going between a logical statement, a programming equation, and figuring out morphisms and category theory. And that gives us a way to also talk about like different levels of science and different levels of complexity, and still be valid, and not being predicated off of some secret and unrealized metaphor.
Yeah. And these structures, Lavier's structures, have been unbelievably powerful. Like Urs Schreiber, who is a physicist foremost and a mathematician second, and a philosopher distant third. But he has developed Lavier's calculus further into a particular direction, which Lavier might not actually like a lot. But in any case, he has developed it further, and it comes really, really close to M theory, so to the common generalization of the different string theories and supergravity. So it comes really, really close to a description of the universe that is congruent with what we know from physics at this point in time. So this is, of course, really interesting because Hegel, again, had also this kind of totalizing view of society. And a lot of what Hegel said can be reinterpreted in a way that it becomes useful, or not just useful, but true through these through these mathematical theories or mathematical physical theories. Yeah, I think I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So aside from just trying to save Hegel, because I have a deep love, but also ambivalence about Hegel, because I do suspect like that sometimes when he's right by accident.
Oh yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Because of course the question is, how did Hegel kind of figure this out? And he credits supersensuous inner intuition for this, and he explicitly draws comparisons to mysticism. And he says that his method is, in a sense, mystical. In another sense, it is scientific. It is kind of both. So the but he says that he developed this from inner speculation, which is kind of, well, first of like the rational part of my brain, alarm clocks are shrilling, because like inner intuition can be anything, but the question arises of if this stuff is actually, if Laber didn't just see whatever in Hegel, but actually saw things in Hegel that were in Hegel, then how did Hegel figure this out? And this poses some very fundamental questions and goes into it goes into the question of mysticism and its applicability to the sciences and to physics and mathematics in particular. And it opens some very interesting thoughts and my kind of position. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but I'm a mathematicist, so I do believe that the universe is a mathematical structure. And then this kind of conflict goes away because, particularly in category theory, mathematical structures often have a very great degree of recursiveness, and where kind of lower dimensional structures are imitated by higher dimensional structures and vice versa. And then it just makes sense that within our universe, if we've evolved, which I assume, and our thinking has evolved to understand the natural laws or to survive, but surviving it's useful to understand natural laws to survive. Then it makes sense that within our thinking are traces of the logical systems that the universe itself is following. So then it makes sense that through inner intuition, kind of like you would understand normal logic or kind of predicate logic, without ever having the need to formalize predicate logic, that you would also intuitively understand dialectics without ever having to try to formalize dialectics. That it is just something that is inherent to our thinking because it is inherent to our universe, because our universe is mathematical. And mathematical is, or mathematics shows dialectical structures.
Mm-hmm. So as a mathematicist, and I like to use that term, I normally call people who mathematicists Platonists, but not in the sense of normal, just because they believe that math is an actual reality.
Well,
I find it so. You may know my position. My position is usually an abducted position, in which I think that what math is describing is real. I do not know that math itself, the way we use it, is real. But I have to admit that convergent development through non-scientific means, meaning that like we will hit on certain truths by basically by accident, but or by trying to be consistent in a weird framework, like you go into Buddhist Abhidharma, our Christian Catholic Christian logics, and you start seeing these things emerge that rhyme. And well, if you take the theory that the universe is basically mathematical, and we, as existing in the universe, have some natural inclination to understand that because it is of use for our survival, then it would make sense that these things would develop even pre a modern scientific framework, because we're going to interpret certain things through a culturalist lens, but what we are intuiting or feeling are working out logically, we would all have, because that's part of what our brains evolved to do. I admit that that's like a good pushback on my kind of culturalist views of, say, math, because there is a sense in which math does develop universally. Now, what is interesting is I know what we're going to get for this, because I've seen people push back on me when I say that like that math is not racialized, and people are like, "Oh yeah, it is. It was developed by," and I'm like, well, one, our modern math technologies are not all a product of Europe at all. And by technologies I mean like numbers, zero, concept, like
Indian numeral system.
Yeah, the Indian numeral system, a lot of Arabic innovations in logic and geometry, and there were convergent developments in indigenous cultures in the Americas. So, you know, uh, you get into the unprovable hypothesis about like, well, the convergences are superficial, blah blah blah. Well, to me, if to a certain point, it doesn't matter. Like, if they do the same things, even if the convergences were accidental or superficial, then anyway, it's not a big deal. But I think that's an interesting, pushback on the kind of Foucauldian inclinations that we're all kind of taught in humanities programs, that cultures are kind of self-sufficient, completely sui generis, and that individuals are either completely tabula rasa or so much tabula rasa that we can't talk about this stuff, and you cannot make cost-cultural comparisons using math without imposing some kind of like Eurocentric or white-centric, standard upon other societies, which is to me a weird argument, but it's one that is super common on the left. I think that's the other one that you get. We haven't talked about it as much, but like there's a lot of, even, if you're not dealing with Marxist Leninist, and to be fair, outside of Europe, you're probably not a lot, unless you're dealing in the United States with teenagers. The are well, let me rephrase that. Are in China with big brackets, China, but in general, you're going to get a lot of postmodernist pushback to this stuff, and my response to that is, if you take a lot of the post-structural assumptions seriously, you can't explain change in society at all. You just can't. Like, it's arbitrary. And people will say contingent when they mean arbitrary. I mean, yes, of course it's contingent, but you're describing it as completely random, and there's no way to understand the transition, because you can understand contingencies. And then the second issue that you get is there's no way to even communicate these understandings that would be universally meaningful. So even to state a relativist position becomes kind of a, the classic, like, well, to state the relativist position, to state it is to state it in absolute terms, and you get into a fucking linguistic paradox or a linguistic contradiction.
Well, who was the Greek who said that we can't know if reality is real, if anything is real? If we knew anything was real, we certainly can't communicate it. And some third thing. But in any case, it doesn't matter. But what I wanted to say is, first of all, there is a kind of linguistic problem that we have with mathematics that we don't have with other sciences, because mathematics can both describe a field of science and the object it studies. And you don't have this problem with physics. You wouldn't say physics when you mean the universe. But you do have it with mathematics, which introduces a kind of linguistic confusion. And then you can ask, well, is there even a real structure behind it? And that makes it all even more complicated. So this is a problem. And the second thing I wanted to mention is, well, the postmodernists can afford to do that because they don't really want to change society. They've basically given up. Like, we want to change society. We should really use science. We can't just say, well, it's all regimes of power or whatever, because these sciences are useful to us, or they can be useful to us.
Okay, well, that's a good point. It is, I don't know how you feel about the works of Alain Badiou, but this is a point that he makes: is once you give up on the idea of an objective truth, the idea of social change becomes just completely irrelevant because it's arbitrary anyway.
We could just give up.
Yeah, why bother? I mean, and there is a sense. I actually admired the American postmodernists more than the European ones on this, because they admitted this, where the European ones were still kind of like gesture vaguely towards the possibility of radical change. You have people like Richard Worley, who's just like, no, I'm like, we just should be, humane bourgeois liberals because we can't think of anything else, so it doesn't really matter anyway. So go be humane bourgeois liberals. And
or
I
happy
find that,
nihilists.
our happy nihilists, which I can grok as an answer, kinda, but it still makes social change sort of like, well, why bother? And so I think this was the point. This was Badiou was arguing against not just post-structuralists, but also utilitarians and empiricists. And I, in my vague, broad gestures way, have always said, well, the modern scientific method is kind of the dialectical combination of logical and empirical methodologies of like the early Enlightenment. And people are like, yeah, but and I'm like, yeah, that's not strictly speaking true, but it's the best way to understand it, where we are like, we have a logical check on empirical claims and an empirical check on logical claims, like which beforehand we did not. So I think that's important. And this brings me to one last question, though, and I know this is for people who don't understand math, this has been kind of into the deep end of the pool and then moving rapidly back to the shallow end and then back into the deep end of the pool. I want people to listen and realize that this is important and also interesting, like, because I suffered from a bad American mathematics education until literally graduate school, and I thought math was not interesting. And two things changed that. One was I had a really good statistics class, and two, I got really interested into the debates around string theory's provability versus classical model physics, of which math theory is absolutely crucial, and with which and this has practical effects, practical thing, argumentation, like there's practical implications of it, as well as what we might call metaphysical implications of it. And I realized that, like, hey, this math shit was interesting. And then I realized that I wasn't actually that bad at it, because I think most people, the idea that you are language brained or math brained, to me, is nonsense. Because they overlap. Even in, like, if you look at like where the areas of and I will say, take all this with a grain of salt. We realize the problems with cognitive neurology and mental imaging, but it does look like, for example, when you use language, parts of your brain light up, and similar parts of your brain light up when you do math. They're not actually that separate, and to see them as opposing entities is just fundamentally wrong. But this is a big but. What are the complications of category theory? You sent me one article that was really above my pay grade, but I've been reading it. And it was like the problems are failures of category theory. It wasn't a debunking of category theory. It's just trying to go into the things that we still don't yet know or haven't figured out or don't have a theory for. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yes, and but before that, I just wanted to mention, like, I used to hate math in my school education, and
so I'm not the only one.
No, and I also like, university education was a lot better. It was a lot more fun. You basically go through all the concepts that you learn in school again, but way better. But it's still not that good. Yeah, with category theory, I actually started to do it for procrastination. That's part of what made me pretty knowledgeable in this area. That when I had some formal task I should do or something, I would just look at category theory instead. So category theory was really kind of life changer for me, in that it made mathematics mathematics really fun, and I was actually thinking about quitting and doing something artsy or something. And mathematics can be artful, but I thought it was not really for me. But category theory really changed that. And what was your question again?
Well,
Right. The failures of or the insufficiencies of category theory.
mm-hmm.
So one thing that a lot of people don't understand about pure math is that the structures that are studied within pure math are actually very, very simple. That is why we can say a lot of interesting things about them, because again, the clearer the water, the farther you can see. And if the objects are very simple, then you can say a lot about them. But of course, something like economic processes are not very simple. There are a lot of feedback loops. There are all kinds of interactions. There are just basic questions like what is money, what is value, um, things that are pre-mathematical in a sense that because mathematics usually starts with the definitions, and that's before the definition is even taken. And category theory was really devised for purely mathematical purposes. So it was devised for simple quantitative systems. So kinds of failures of category theory, particularly to economics, which was with this article I sent you, are, for instance, that mathematics or category theory usually deals with statements like for everything in this thing, there is something in this other thing. In economics, you often don't have these precise statements, but you have like most things that are this, or they become this, or something. So it's not completely correct statements, but it's kind of probabilistic statements that you say the amount of things that don't follow this process are negligible, or something like that. That's one failure. Another failure is that category theory usually deals with qualitative systems. It is less designed for quantitative systems. And this is actually something that I am working on, is getting category theory to work with quantities, not just qualities of objects. Another failure is, this ties kind of into the first thing, that strict logic is often not the best way to approach economics, but what you need is a kind of probabilistic weakening of logic, or maybe even a kind of para-consistent logic or something like that. And category theory has a lot of experience with suspending the law of the excluded middle, saying that a statement can be neither A nor the negation of A. Or for a thing, this can be true, that it is neither A nor the negation of A, but it hasn't really dealt with contradictory statements or something like that, which you often have in economics, that you get data sets that contain information that might be contradictory because, for instance, one part of the information is just wrong, and you need to have a framework for handling that. What are other insufficiencies? I don't know. These are already a few. I'm sorry. I can't really think about.
That's fine.
Oh, right. There is another one, which is that category theory usually deals with processes that are instantaneous, in the sense that time doesn't really exist within the realm of mathematics itself. It deals with spaces. It deals with all kinds of things. But even when time is, for instance, modeled, it is in essentially a geometric way. You have a space that then has a coordinate that corresponds to time or something. And so the morphisms in category theory usually have no length. Whereas, for instance, with an economic process, you might want to say that this process requires this amount of labor power, or this amount of capital, or whatever. So these processes, if you want them to be morphisms, for instance, they should have a certain length. So you need to introduce length into category theory. This also goes into things that I am researching on right now. So this is another failure. You need to kind of get metric back into category theory. Yeah.
No, these are all useful, and it actually illustrates a couple of problems in general. So, for example, a common complaint against analytic philosophy, which is not universally true, but it is generally true, like you can look through enough of modern Anglo-American analytic philosophy and see this trend is time is factored out because of the analogy to math, or if time is treated, it is treated as identical to space, which in terms of understanding historical processes is kind of fucking useless. So it's that's a general problem in analytic philosophy. And conversely, it also makes people like the Cleodynamics people who are trying to do math in history and trying to say history if mathematically solvent, which I am sympathetic with. You always, however, have to look at how they're modeling things and what they're bracketing out of their models, because they're bracketing out something in time or in duration or in category to make a claim, because right now there's not a simple way to do that with one type of math. Like, there are maths that can handle that. That's not my point. But it's there's not one way in which there's not a universal theory yet that ties all these things together, which would be necessary. And if someone was to come up with it, like, we probably could start looking at history a lot more mathematically solvently, which right now we just kind of can't do. I mean, we can talk about statistics or, fuzzy logics, fuzzy maths. And then you get into, God, this is beyond today, but one day I need to get someone on to explain to Marxists like the arguments about statistics and Bayesianism and all this, because they just seem to not want to touch it at all. But these are the kinds of problems that you occur, like you run into. For me, the reason why I wanted to have you on to talk about this, and I plan on having you back probably in a couple months, is I wanted people to see that there's these categories of mathematics that seem obscure. They're actually incredibly important for us to be able to do things like, if we want to start going back and doing proper Marxist dialectics, but with an understanding of systems theory, general systems theories, then we're also going to have to go back and like incorporate modern mathematics, which we're finding out vindicate elements of Hegelian and Marxist logic. No, it's not perfect, and there's going to be things we have to jettison. I'm not sure what they are yet, but that, I always like to say that is what Marx and Engels would have done. Like if you read Engels's anthropological work, he hits on some key things that he's kind of accidentally correct on, and he hits on some stuff that's total bullshit, because of like general 19th century assumptions about things like Lemurians. But it was still scientifically valid and working with the context of his day, and he would have updated it if he had our science. Like, the fact that Darwin and Lamarck were bourgeois scientists didn't stop Engels from trying to use them, right?
Yeah.
And that's a pretty big point.
And Marx went into mathematics precisely because he wanted to do it to his understanding of philosophy and stuff. And he wanted it for his economics. And I think Engels said that he wants to teach, I don't know, his students or something, analysis for preparing for their battle plans. I mean, I don't know how important and why analysis is important for battle plans, but he seemed to have an idea. And I think there are definitely areas of mathematics that are important for like geopolitical strategy and stuff. Definitely. Even just in the modern time, you need to have like a grasp of theoretical computer science or practical computer science at the very least, to build up parallel structures that you can use to coordinate. And you need to have some idea of how you can construct like models for whatever interactions you have Like you often talk about game theory. That's also part of this. That you have a game theoretic understanding of the interactions that occur within the normal political context and within the international context between nation states.
But I do, and a lot of people get really worried about that because they say, well, game theory developed in the course of the Cold War, and I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't mean that all of it was wrong. Also, when getting into math theories, a lot of times what people are talking about with game theory is zero sum game theory based off of Cold War novels, but there are other game theoretic frameworks that are useful and that are not necessarily zero sum. Although usually I will say when modeling nation state competition, you probably should model zero sum competition. That's just for reasons that I think are about the nature of nation states, not more than the nature of people. That's how they operate. I actually would advise against modeling people in most cases on zero sum games. For example, I don't think that works. But
Yeah,
but it does require a little bit of knowledge of math, and then once you see it, it's one of those things where, like, I find that we spend a lot of time in the emotive parts of theory, and psychoanalysis and all this, and one of the things I will say is I've become convinced that psychoanalysis is actually useful over time, which I used to not believe, even though I do think a lot of its science is horribly out of date. That there's some thick description there that rhymes with things that we will probably find.
yeah, but can I just say some food for thought? I think Marxists are actually really shooting themselves in the foot by following Freud, but completely neglecting Jung. Because think about who won the culture war. Fucking Jung. Even before Joseph Campbell, and before Jordan Peterson, you had Tolkien, you had Frank Herbert, and you had Hermann Hesse. And Tolkien sold like the most books, I think, in the last century, and among the most books of all time. And again, then you had Joseph Campbell, who kind of made Jungian psychology into a recipe that now is every movie ever. And then you have Jordan Peterson, who trivializes the whole thing again and kind of uses it as a kind of conservative self-help thing, and is really successful with it. So yeah, I'm not saying Jung is not worthy of criticism, but I think there is something powerful about the theory, because otherwise it just wouldn't have the popular appeal that it does.
What's interesting about it is of the psychoanalytic theories, like you teach Freudianism, death drive and whatnot, that has an intuitive, id and ego has an intuitive appeal to it, particularly if you put it in the German and not the English weird translation. But you start talking about Oedipus and Electra complexes, and people start looking at you like you're crazy. Whereas there's some weird shit in Jung. As a side note, the first psychoanalytic literature I ever read, and I read it in high school, was Jung. And it was because, it was everywhere in the 90s. I mean, it was everywhere. And Jungian archetypes are a lot of people's first introduction to anything like semiotics. And universal symbols and symbol parallels and how symbols work in the brain. And it's natural, and it's natural enough that it's the only form of psychoanalysis that in the United States is taught in high school. It's taught in literature class. It's not, but like we always teach the monomyth and reoccurrent symbols, and sometimes we'll even be explicit and say they come out of Jungian psychology. This is contested science, but it's generally accepted in cultural criticism. And Marxists don't touch it. Marxists love Lacan, which is at minimum the most difficult form of psychoanalysis to deal with. Um, uh, and I think deliberately so, and I kind of hate it, but I have softened on certain Lacanian lectures as actually being useful. But that's neither here nor there. And I think it's important that if we are going to maintain things like Lacan, that we engage with people like Jung, because one thing I will tell you is Jordan Peterson's a bad Jungian. Like he's
Oh
actually
yeah.
like he's a bad Christian. He's a bad Jungian. He's not even a good conservative. Like, and I find that what I found, I went to this conference on Jordan Peterson and I spoke at it. And what I found frustrating is all the critiques of him were like based off of leftist assumptions. And I was like, no, the way you should approach him is you should actually dig into Jung. You should actually dig into like Orthodox Christianity and then point out from there how it's bullshit. Then we can deal with the leftist assumptions and bring that in. But if you cede all that ground, it makes it look like we're talking from a space where he represents one thing and we're from another planet. And we're from planet postmodern neo-Marxism. And he's from planet pragmatist or whatever, who likes lobsters.
Use whatever.
Yeah.
The whole thing should collapse on itself, and it's still wildly successful, which tells you something about the concepts that he uses and the power.
Yeah. And so I think we need to talk. Like, I would love for someone to take up a and to try to do it with scientific validity, not just as cultural criticism, but like to talk about like the capitalist monomyths and where they show up and how we could find them. And yes, people would then critique that and point out how they're not universally applicable. And that's great.
Yeah.
Like there's such a thing as a productive failure, which for me with Jung is undoubtedly true because there are some fundamental assumptions in Jung that just don't hold. But there's a reason, like, yeah, he's more popular. He actually won the continued relevance. Yes, we all talk about Freud, but Freud is kind of taught in high school, but he's always taught as like, well, there is this guy Freud. He realized that sex was important. He came up with the idea of the unconscious. Here's some weird shit he thought that we no longer believe. Bye. Like, that's the way if you encounter him in high school, which you probably don't, but if you do, you encounter him in a history of psychology class. And that's the way he's taught. Whereas if you encounter Jung, you encounter him in a cultural studies or a high school English class as a way to understand literature and narrative structure. And yeah, he clearly won on that. Like, there's no Freudian monomyth. Like, anyway, that's a great point. Actually, thank you. That's a different rant, but it's a good rant. I also think one thing you and I, weirdly, we've been talking about math. We also take spiritual stuff seriously, not because I believe in its metaphysical reality. I don't in most cases. But because I think you do have to understand the way a lot of the world has thought, and a lot of the way modern math and logic developed was out of different kinds of theologies. And if you don't understand that, then you can't even really talk about the history of the development of human thought.
Yeah. And I mean, we didn't get hugely into this, but I actually read up a lot on the history of mysticism within physics and mathematics, particularly in the last 2 centuries. And it's really interesting. It's such a great amount of people and really, really qualified people had kind of mystical inclinations and even advocated for them as a kind of way to understand physical reality. Like Arthur Eddington wrote a great defense of mysticism in his book The Nature of the Physical World. He really went into it and he really explained his reasoning, and like that's a really first-rate physicist. Like, he's one of the 3 people of whom it is often said that they understood relativity theory at that point in time.
I
And yeah, it's so many mathematicians, like way up there mathematicians, among the best ever. Like Grothendieck was very much into mysticism, particularly toward the end of his life, and it wasn't a particularly good idea for him. But at the same time, there was definitely something there, and there is something that I don't know, like highly intelligent and highly unusual thinking, or highly intelligent and highly unusual thinkers, I think, are often particularly inclined towards these kinds of thoughts for some reason. I mean, it's kind of a cliche that like genius and insanity are close to each other. But if you look at like mathematicians of the last century, but even before that, like Newton and stuff, it's kind of true. Um, it's
well,
really interesting.
I used to argue in the new atheist days. I used to point out to people that, like, okay, psychologists and biologists are likely to be atheists. Mathematicians and physicists can go either way. But a lot of the important ones actually are, if not religious, highly weird.
Yeah.
Like, and I think at least, even if you're gonna like talk about things in a materialistic framework, which I think actually as good Marxists we need to do, at least methodologically, if not ontologically, um, we do have to admit that there's something going on there that is highly productive, even if it's mistaken, towards human thought. And to just be like, well, religious thinking is bad, um, isn't going to get you very far. Um, and it definitely brackets out like the development of like a shit ton of math, physics, and even biology. Like, so it's, you know, it may be insufficient, which I think it definitely is. I mean, but it's important, which is why I'm a big advocate of the Marxists should, not all of us, because if you take everything I advocate Marxists should do, the average Marxist should have 25 PhDs and also be a working class person, which of course is ridiculous. But some of us should take up the study of religion. Some of us should take up the study of math and take it up seriously and engage with the literature as it exists now, not just come in when we're going to try to prove whatever Trotsky said in 1914 correct. Um, and and I think that's an important thing, and I think it's definitely true of math. And if you got getting into math, I remember I read this was before I was really into math, but I read a David Foster Wallace book on the history of infinities, and went into mysticism and insanity come up a lot. It's like
Cantor, of course.
yeah, yeah. I mean, just over and over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Um,
and I mean, the thought about the infinite was, of course, a central tenet of religious practice, particularly within Christianity, and a justification for like the divine nature of the human, which I'm against that because I don't think that we are any more or less divine than, for instance, animals, or probably than thinking machines if they ever exist. But it was a way that people thought about these things, and it is a kind of source of confound con, confound confu, confoundation that we can actually, as like finite beings, grasp infinite concepts, at least on a maybe superficial level compared to the actual infinite. But I mean, it is weird,
yeah,
I
I mean,
find.
the moment that you start positing, I mean, and I think I even realized this in middle school, but I didn't really think about it a lot until very recently. When you start dealing with the idea of like, well, there's an infinite number of infinities between one set of numbers and another set of numbers, but if one set of numbers is larger than the other, theoretically, there's more infinite infinities between. Boom. Um, like that, like that itself, it introduces two things. Either you're going to become a skeptic of the idea of knowledge at all, or you're going to have to deal with the fact that there are concepts that our immediate practical inclinations are just going to disabuse. Um, and thus we should probably take them seriously. And that's going to look a lot like a lot of mythical traditions and stuff. And I also think there is something about the way the human mind works that reproduces these things over and over again. Otherwise, they would not exist.
Yeah.
Because they develop like you start like when you start doing comparative stuff between like Buddhist mythical traditions and theological well, they're not theological for them, it's ontological, cosmological, and like Christian, Judeo-Christian, Islamic ones, you start seeing that there's convergent developments, and they really aren't traceable to cultural exposure in the case of like Shin Buddhism in Japan in the 12th century and Islamicate Platonism in say North Africa. There's not a direct line. Even the Mongols don't explain like cross-cultural contamination there. So either these things develop because of certain logical deductions that are made in a system and would have been made in any system, or you have a hard time explaining what's going on. Or you just have to like, well, it was statistically lucky, right?
Yeah.
Those are your options, really.
Yeah. But there's definitely weirdly prescient stuff all over the world, like Buddhism with the ideas of many worlds. I mean, it's really similar to some physical theories, or like the Greek idea that the whole universe or the whole world is just falling all the time, and that explains why nature works the way it works. Well, I mean, this is a very simple model, but some of the current physical models are like, well, the universe is expanding all the time. I mean, it's not that dissimilar.
Yeah,
So,
falling's just one directional. Expanding is falling in every direction. So like, yeah, I mean, yeah. I do remember, all the cosmological debates about eternalism, and then looking at math, and then looking at rev shifts, and then like, oh well, there's a lot to going on here that actually we somehow intuitively in theological and cosmological systems that we now have physical evidence that's practical for, and some of it does blow your mind, like the whole, you can't the difficulty in explaining quantum and non-quantum mechanics when you think about the fact that at one point the universe by dint of definition only existed at a quantum level. Like that
yeah,
that kind of stuff is the stuff that's like doesn't keep me up at night, but it's like you do get like, oh, there really is wonder in science and math, and it's really interesting and fascinating, and we should get people caring about it again,
yeah,
on
and
particularly on the left.
yeah, and this is also something that kind of annoys me with some people on the left, that they often their mental conception is often one of like matter and of physics as it was in like the 18th century or something, where
Oh yeah, they're
where
like
it looked
basically
like,
Newtonians at best. Like,
yeah, yeah, and they are, and so it appears a lot more gross to them than it actually is. It's there is truly some not magical in the sense of I don't know, I don't even know what magic is, but there
that
is
word is much
some
harder to
wondrous.
define. Magic is a word, believe that, like, I was listening to The Secret History of Esotericism, which seems like it's a podcast about philosophy. I mean, it seems like it's a podcast about magic, and it is, but it's more of a podcast about philosophy. But the thing that they say is like, no one actually has a functional definition of magic. Like it's just like there's always some kind of weird, like, okay, well, how is magic different than religious belief? Well, the only actual historical thing in the ancient world is magic was forbidden religious practices. That's what it meant. Like, what is magical thinking? Well, thinking that doesn't fall within the lanes of logic, except it does often have a logic. It's just not it's a different causal logic, of maybe one that conflates categories, and then you're like, well, how's that different than other kinds of thinking? Which is not to say that people should go out and do magic. That's not my point. My point is that these categories are actually more difficult than they seem. And you know, as people have pointed out, and often charlatans have abused, it's impossible to separate the development of chemistry from alchemy and stuff like that. Like, and alchemy also was not just parlor magic. It also had a lot of moral philosophy tied into it, because that's the way people in, you know, the late Middle Ages thought. But and it's not, one of the things that I always point out, it's not as far into our thinking as we'd like to pretend it is. So,
Oh no. And it, again, it can be kind of useful. Like, I think the same thing that makes us think magically is the same thing that makes us like, that really fastens up our thinking, in that we just jump between like topics, and that we start looking at the big picture, in a sense, and kind of forget about the details for a second. That can be highly useful. I mean, it's similar to what happens with psychedelics, you know. Like, I don't know if you know this, but there was an experiment in, I think, the 60s, where they gave a bunch of scientists psychedelics, and they often and they told them that they should kind of think about the theories, and they often made remarkable progress. In spite of the fact that the thinking is kind of disturbed because they were high, you know.
That's interesting. All right. Well, thank you, Alex, for coming on. And we will see you again. Is there anything you'd like to plug before you leave?
Um, I was thinking, and if you want, you can cut that part. But I was thinking that I would start a reading group on your Discord with a category theory book that is precisely for non-mathematicians who are interested in category theory. And we could read, like, I don't know. We'll see how fast we can go. And I could clear up misconceptions or whatever. So if any of your people are, of course, some people are on Discord, they can look this up in the next few days or something.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm gonna keep that in, because I like the idea of so people who don't know, my Discord has an open policy for reading groups. And if yes, the Discord goes to patrons first, but if you ask me nicely, I'll let you into the Discord just for asking me. And we've had different kinds of reading groups. We've had a cybernetic theory reading group. We've had a Capitals Volume 1 and 2 reading group. I promised that I wouldn't do another capital reading group, so that's not done by other people. But the idea of my Discord is that we set up skill sharing communities and stuff out of interest. And so if you're interested, like I said, if you're not a patron, you can just send me a message on Twitter, or my email is actually attached to the YouTube channel. And I will send you that link. All patrons get it. So thank you so much, Alex, and I hope you do that. And I at least am going to read that book once you say what it is. All right. Have a good evening. Thank you for coming on. Bye-bye.
Bye.